problem in society we have at the moment is everyone is afraid of making a mistake.
What may happen if we don't do anything?
The pandemic has changed life as we know it. But what comes next? Will our fast-paced lives pick up again? Will we continue to innovate, regardless of the cost? Live lives profit-driven and globally connected? Or has this pandemic sparked irrevocable change? How will we live in the future after the pandemic?
Hello and welcome to DW's COVID-19 special. I'm Stephen Beardsley in Berlin. Now, this week we're peeking ahead and imagining life after the COVID-19 pandemic. Our guest today is Richard Sennett. He's a British-American sociologist and one of the world's most important theorists of urban studies, or the architecture and social life of cities. Sennett is currently a member of the Council of Urban Initiatives for United Nations Habitat, and since the beginning of the outbreak, he's written about his concerns for city life amid growing pandemic restrictions. Professor Sennett, welcome to the show. You've described a city as a settlement in which strangers are likely to meet one another. There hasn't been a whole lot of that lately, given the pandemic. As vaccines come online and more people are vaccinated, are you optimistic that the city will come back?
I am. Indeed, I think it has to come back because in the long term, we need places where people can interact face to face. We need it economically. We need dense cities for the sake of climate change amelioration. It's not an option for people to live long-term socially distanced lives.
Professor, when we talk about cities, of course, we talk about the architecture of the city is one thing, and we also talk about social interactions. When we look first at the architecture, what could this mean for how cities are planned in terms of, I'm thinking of open spaces, for example, elevators that are probably being avoided now more than ever. What do you see?
Well, I think long-term, this argues, just as does climate change, for much more flexible ways of building cities, to not make spaces which can only be used in one way. It might be that the age of the skyscraper is over, or that we're going to have to rethink public transport. But I'd say about both, the issue is how to think about adaptable spaces, not to transform these spaces into places which are stricken by fear, in which the extremes of social isolation, to which the panic has plunged us, are going to lead to permanently socially isolated spaces. It's a question of experiment, spacing people out in public transportation, figuring different ways to use elevators and so on. It's trivial. Mm-hmm. The horrible thing would be to freeze the environment.
We talk about the social interactions that make up a city as well. You mentioned them as well, that face-to-face interaction. Do you think the pandemic has at least made us more aware of our social connections, the social capital that we have in day-to-day life?
Can you imagine a life spent on Zoom? What kind of human experience that would be? This is the notion. It's what I'm saying. The danger in this is that you naturalize the extreme. That you take Zoom or even working from home in isolation full-time as a norm. Can't do that. It's a very evocative where we are today of what happened to New York 20 years ago after it was hit by 9/11. Almost immediately, all the planning codes in New York were rewritten as though every week another airplane would fly into a New York skyscraper. Didn't happen, but for about a decade, the city was paralyzed in building these fortress-like structures. That's what we have to avoid, that kind of paralysis.
And yet at the same time, there is a real danger, as we know, from the virus. So how do we find the right way of measuring the importance of our social lives with the real devastation that the virus can cause?
Well, there I'd say, this is just my personal opinion, but there I'd say we really have a problem here. The virus was going to radically transform our lives. Looked that way a year ago when there were no vaccines and there were very few drugs that could treat people who were sick. Now we're in a very different place, and I hope you in Germany soon will be in that place as well, where people who are vaccinated have a big weapon to use against the virus, and these medicines which are coming on stream mean that even if you fall sick, you're not doomed to die. And so we need to change our consciousness about, we have to take on board that this narrative has changed what we think of when we use the term the virus. It's not a death sentence. Me, again, is very redolent of the AIDS crisis in New York in the 1980s, when at the beginning of it, people thought this was Armageddon. And gradually, it became a chronic disease. But many of the kind of practices that people were recommending in the 1980s to deal with AIDS were the notion that anybody who was touched by it was going to die. And that became very, very counterproductive over the long term. I mean, it's sort of odd that I'm saying this to you. I'm very old. I'm one of the people who's supposed to be most at risk from this virus. But it just seems to me that being paralyzed with fear is a horrible way to live. And now that we don't need to be paralyzed with fear, we've got to move on mentally and think about ways to live with it rather than feel overwhelmed by it. In Britain, I don't know how this is in Germany, but in Britain you sell newspapers or social media by inflaming the sense of fear, being very, very afraid. It's overwhelming. That's good for journalism, but it's not good for human beings. And so I really see this as a moment where we've got to think it's going to be over. For you, I hope it'll be over. Could I say one more thing about this for you?
Sure.
The biggest threat to me that you face in Europe is that the mismanagement during the last year of the crisis could lead to the breakup of the European Union. That would be a terrible long-term outcome, where nations think that, because the Union largely failed you, that it should be abandoned for really essential things. People go back to the nation state. That would be a terrible way to, as it were, naturalize this state of emergency for the future for you. And, so I just think it's very important to look forward rather than learning lessons about how dangerous the crisis is.
All right. We'll have to leave it there for now. Richard Sennett, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you.
And now it's time for your questions. Over to our science correspondent, Derek Williams.
What impact has the pandemic had on the public perception of science?
This is the perfect question to start off this week's look at visions of the post-COVID world, because one of the things the pandemic has done is radically changed the way that many of you out there in the public view science and scientists. Some have turned into really famous figures who are now really well known, not just in their home countries, but all over the world. Germany also, of course, gained a few new science celebrities in 2020. The most prominent of them, virologist-in-chief Christian Drosten. Millions of Germans tune in for his regular pandemic podcasts. He's even been turned into a traditional Christmas ornament. So one way COVID-19 has certainly changed public perception of science is by dragging researchers and science experts out of the shadows they'd mostly worked in up until now, and thrusting them and their fields onto center stage. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of kids here in Germany now saying, I want to grow up to be the next Christian Drosten. And if you ask me, that's a great thing.